2019, eco-activist Greta Thunberg was invited to attend a UN climate conference in New York. Doing that requires transatlantic travel. Thunberg had already refused a few speaking invitations and won an award because she absolutely didn't want to travel by air and increase her carbon footprint. But this time, she wondered if there was a better option. She finally decided to accept an offer to travel by sailboat. And after 14 days at sea, she arrived in New York. Of course, the voyage was subject to a lot of criticism about whether it actually had zero negative impact on the environment. But the symbolism of Thunberg's dedication mattered more. The effect of the flyg scam, or flight shame movement that erupted after the trip, was documented. In Sweden alone, domestic air travel decreased by 9%, while the volume of train travel increased all across Europe. The trend was even discussed at this year's IATA conference. Of course, 2019 introduced an even bigger threat to aviation than a 16-year-old girl. According to the European Travel Commission, global CO2 emissions dropped by an unprecedented 7% in 2020. The work that Greta Thunberg and other eco-activists started pre-pandemic got amplified as traveler values and behaviors changed, and it only continues to grow. So let's talk about green travel and how the industry adopts sustainable travel practices. Tourism may not have a totally bad rap, but it has more than a few negatives. Sure, it creates job opportunities for locals, and some places rely on tourism for large chunks of their GDP. But at the same time, the large influx of foreigners leads to overcrowding, damaged environments and habitats, and even cultural changes as locals adapt their traditions to better fit tourist expectations. To travel considering these problems and attempting to minimize your negative impact would mean you were traveling sustainably, ethically, or responsibly. What does it mean in practice? Basically, there are 3 types of actions a sustainable traveler can take. The first is reducing your environmental impact, such as taking a train, conserving water and energy, or paying carbon offsets at booking. Second is contributing to the local economic prosperity. For example, staying at locally owned hotels or choosing small local touring companies to make sure that tourism benefits communities. And third is creating a positive social impact, so donating to local charities and volunteering to directly better the place you're visiting. Of course, doing all this work falls on the traveler's shoulders. In 2021, Booking.com surveyed 29,000 travelers across 30 countries. 46% of respondents stated that the pandemic influenced them to travel more sustainably. Yet, half of all people admitted that it was harder to make sustainable choices when traveling, especially not knowing how to look for sustainable options. In other words, most travelers feel the moral obligation to travel greener and would travel greener if they had the choice. So let's talk about some ways the industry meets traveler demand for better, more sustainable choices. We'll start with making a positive environmental impact. Air travel itself is responsible for around 2.5% of global CO2 emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but one person's individual emissions from one transatlantic round-trip flight are 2 times higher than the ones produced by a family car in a year. And that's considering that only about 3% of the population flies frequently. Since the total passenger numbers are only expected to grow, this is an alarming contribution one frequent flyer can make. Of course, not many people have a sailboat and an extra 2 weeks at their disposal when they need to cross the ocean. So, for now, flyers are offered to compare flights by their emission volumes and compensate by donating to green fuel and other climate projects. Yet, consumer behavior is not the only thing that needs to change. In 2021, IATA's 290 airlines committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 as per the Paris Agreement.
So we have planned that our decarbonization will mainly go through the really aggressive increase of usage of sustainable aviation fuel. That's the best technology we have because we know how it functions. We operate already flights with sustainable aviation fuel, so we decided to rely on that.
Luckily, accommodations have many more opportunities to achieve sustainability. Eco-conscious hotels listed on Booking.com can be recognized with a special badge, so users can easily locate them in search results. If the property reduces its plastic and water consumption, recycles, doesn't waste food, uses green energy, and more, it will be highlighted on the platform. Another great way for accommodations to communicate their efforts is by certification. Green travel accreditation bodies, such as GSTC, EU Ecolabel, LEED, EDGE, and others assess how hotels, tour operators, and other travel businesses manage their resources, including getting their produce locally and avoiding pesticides. So, green practices are actually the least vague of all as they have clear goals and actions. But how do travels and businesses assure economic sustainability? Big hotels, resorts, and all-inclusives, especially those owned by foreign corporations, are not preferred stays for ethical tourists. The same goes for devotees of different travel trend, authentic or like a local traveling. Going to a street food vendor instead of a familiar KFC, staying in someone's home rather than a hotel, buying a gift from an artisan instead of a shop. These experiences promise to be more rewarding, both for the tourist and the local economy, but they do require a bit more confidence and research to discover. Airbnb is the most accessible way to find stays and tours provided by locals. Other popular platforms like Agoda or Expedia also offer choices of homestays, apartments, and B&Bs. Though the biggest contribution to off-the-beaten-path tourism is made by social media and travel bloggers. Experienced travelers and locals changed the way tourists prepared for future trips. Now, TikTok's ethically aware audience latches on to content about authentic dining spots, hidden gems, or travel hacks for inspiration and planning, as well as learning about greenwashing.
We're going to share the idea that greenwashing has got to stop.
And bad wildlife tourism practices. Global travel companies must keep up with customer demand for responsible businesses and find ways to ensure that they're benefiting communities. Global Sustainable Tourism Council, one of the main green travel accreditation organizations, also assesses how well hotels and tour operators prioritize local suppliers, support services by local entrepreneurs, and whether they affect the livelihood of neighborhoods and their operations. This brings us to the final and the most difficult sustainable action to define: social sustainability in travel.
This is our land. It was stolen from us in 1893. We're the indigenous peoples that belong here, yet we can't even afford to be here.
Millions of tourists every year come to other countries to experience an exotic environment or culture. Unfortunately, with limited governmental control and revenue leakage, the tourist sector in such places can be more damaging than rewarding, consuming local resources without giving much back. This is why one of the main principles of ecotourism is participating in activities that will help conserve the environment, not just consume it. Non-government ecotourism organizations in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Indonesia provide tours that allow people to experience the flora and fauna from a safe distance. Local and indigenous communities are directly benefiting from employment, while natural wonders and parks receive funds to develop, improve, and host more travelers every year. Here, destination management organizations play a crucial role. DMOs are basically middlemen helping tourists find local guides, so they're responsible for mitigating tourist-related environmental problems and educating them about responsible tourist practices. People understand sustainability differently. Some consider carbon offsets a meaningful contribution to the cause, while others choose to embrace flight shame and forever turn to trains and buses. Whatever their choices, consumer behavior drives business and industry change.
How dare you!
Travelers want to make better choices, and they will reward companies that will help them do that. Unfortunately, although 3 out of 4 accommodation providers implemented some green practices, at least 30% of them don't believe they're worth communicating to guests. And that's a big mistake. If all parties, including tourists, hotels, air carriers, tour operators, and other participants in the travel economy start the conversation and educate each other on how they can do better, we can achieve great change.